bless this diocese and the work of this diocese, and especially the work of the office of the bishop. Let us all come together, work together for the best interest of the church and beyond the church in this diocese. We ask this in your name. Amen. Amen. Just a brief introduction, because this is kind of a turning point in my life. So about 14 years ago, when I decided to retire in 2011, I had really done almost all my work in the church, in this church, in Good Shepherd. And I thought, well, I think it'd be interesting to try to do some things in the diocese. So I put my name in to run for the High Plains Executive Committee, and at that time, Ruth Woodliff Stanley was the missioner. And the next thing I knew, I got a call from Ruth, and she said, "Could you come down to my church?" At that time, she was the rector at St. Thomas. And she said, "Could you come down and talk to me?" And I said, "Sure." And I hung up, and I turned to Bev, and I said, "Well, that's not going to work." So I went down to see Ruth, and we talked for about a half an hour, and all Ruth wanted to do is make sure that I was honestly wanting to do this. I was serious about this. And we talked for half an hour, and I said, "Yeah, I'm serious. If I take on something, I'm willing to do it." And so that was the beginning of my involvement beyond Good Shepherd. And interesting enough, anyone sitting here can do the same thing. If you want to get involved in the diocese, there's always openings for people. I did that for 2 years, and then I will share one more thing. We had a meeting at St. Luke's in Denver, and at that time we didn't have a missioner, and Jay Swoop was actually filling in as the missioner, as one of the people on the standing committee. And after the meeting was over, he said, "Jim, I'd like to talk to you." And I said, "Okay." We went over in this room, and he said, we sat down. He said, "I've watched you for 2 years, and you're really dedicated to what you're doing here for High Plains. And I'm limited in the position on the standing committee. I'd like you to run for my position on the standing committee." And I said, "Well, I need to go talk to my wife." And
good answer.
And I'll let you know. And I got up to leave. He said, No, sit down." I said, "Okay." He said, "And if you accept that and you get elected, we want you to be the secretary for the standing committee." And I said, "Well, Jay, okay, that gives me 2 things to talk to Bev about." And I started to leave. He said, No, sit down. He said, "And if you get elected, I want you to serve on the Diocesan Finance Committee." He said, "It's really easy. There's virtually nothing to do, but you'll be really knowledgeable on the finances in this diocese." And I just sat there. And he looked at me and he said, "That's all." And the interesting thing about that was, Jay, of course, was attending the cathedral, and the next thing I knew, the cathedral put somebody up to run against me. And I called Jay, and I said, "No, wait a minute, Jay. I don't mind running against somebody, but I'm surprised it's somebody from the cathedral." And he said, "Well, our dean believes that we should be the lead church, and therefore we should have the person on the standing committee." And I said, "Okay." And I said, "What do you know about this?" Jay said, "I don't even know who it is. I don't know this person." And we went to the election, and that person didn't show up. So I got elected at the standing committee. And I did that for 1 term, and I got elected to a second, so I was a secretary for 6 years. And I attended the Diocesan Finance Committee for 6 years. And when I finished that, I wrote a letter to the bishop asking to stay on the Diocesan Finance Committee, but I also said I'd be interested in Cathedral Ridge. And the next thing I know, I got elected to the board for Cathedral Ridge, and immediately they made me the secretary of the board. And so I did that for 5 years, and as some of you know, in February this year, I actually ended up resigning from gift to you. So let's look at what you have. You've got all the information there. If there's any people Zoom, is there any Zooming? You know? Okay, that would be good. Yeah, they can't look at it later. But almost everything I'm going to talk about, and you have the handout, everything's in the handout one. And number two is the fact that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where you can get the information. Pete, did you get a handout? Why don't you come on up here, I'll give it to you. There you go. Everybody else got the handout, okay. First thing I want to mention is the Office of the Bishop. This is my own creation. You can almost get the same thing online. I doubt the one online is updated. As many of you know, when we look at the canon for mission and operations, John Anderson, and actually he's on leave right now, and Lucy Ammerman is filling in for him. Diane Draper, you'll notice there, she has had that position for a long time. She's a parishioner here. Most of you probably know her. I just found out that she is retiring the end of this month. I didn't know that she was retiring. They've been looking for somebody to replace her. The person that's replacing her is listed there. The rest of this is pretty self-explanatory in terms of the positions. After this is next page, or 2 pages now, we're going to talk about the budget. And if you got any questions on this, let me know. You can sit down there where it says key support roles. Reverend, I know him as QC because I can't pronounce his name. But everybody calls him QC. But he actually works half the time for the Episcopal Church and half the time for the Lutheran Church. Correct, yeah. And he mostly into Latino ministry. When I was on the standing committee, I always remember he had just come and been with us for about a year. He was the rector up in Thornton at their church, and actually the Bishop of Arizona took a run at him and to try to get him to come to Arizona. And our bishop picked up the phone and said, "You're not touching him. Don't even think about it. Just forget about it. He's staying here and he's going to be with us." A good friend of mine is Pam Greenfield with the business office. She and I worked together quite a bit because I was on the finance committee for 6 years. When I actually started with the High Plains region, Maria Ryan there, she was actually our administrator. In a couple of weeks, you're going to hear John Hill as the executive director and vicar of Cathedral Ridge. He's going to be here doing a presentation with me on Cathedral Ridge. And as you heard last week, if you were here, Canon Carl Anderson is the disaster director for the diocese. And so what I was going to say, in the back of the room, there is when we do talk about the budget, there is a verbal discussion of the whole budget. You can pick up a copy of that if you want. If we run out of copies, it's on the diocesan website. It's the narrative budget, so you can get it. And when you go through the narrative budget, they will actually define what each one of these people do as their canons, so that'll be there for your convenience. Okay, the next page, which I forgot to put in here, and that's the one page that's separate that you have. This is the bishop's goals for the diocese. This is very interesting because a lot of us really wanted the bishop after the first or second year to come out with a set of goals of what her direction was for the diocese. And what Bishop Kim really wanted to do was spend a lot of time traveling throughout the diocese and finding out what did the people really want, what were their key things that they wanted for the diocese. And so last year, the first time at Diocese Convention, she actually listed 5 goals, and you see the 5 here. One is to build the financial reserves to $3.5 million. They're right around $1 million right now, and she wants to have a bigger reserve on the basis because we have a budget of about $3 million. She'd like to have about $3 million available in case something major happens. I will say, the only thing that surprised me about that and that endowment is right now at 9.6 million. So that endowment is fairly, and the bishop can basically, she could call on that. I guess she'd have to go through the board of trustees for the foundation, but that money is really set aside for use in the diocese. Continue building our relationships with the Lutheran and the Methodist Church. I think we've worked on that for the last few years. Plant 2 to 3 new parishes. We haven't planted a parish for the last 15 years. We've now planted one down in Sterling Ranch. Father Gary and myself were there for their celebration Friday night. It was a great celebration. They seem to be doing well. I think, were they introduced at the last convention, or are they going to be introduced? I think
they're being introduced formally, and it's on the agenda for next week.
Yeah, so, but I think their vicar, since their mission, is a former assistant at St. Tim's, Lauren Grubaugh Thomas, right? And I did a lot of things with Lauren when she was at St. Timothy's, and she lives down in Sterling Ranch, and she started this. It's a great story about how they started. So we got one going there. I understand there is on the western slope, and I think it's in Ouray, they're starting up a church that basically stopped. They're restarting that one, and I think they count that one too. The one place in this region where there's a great opportunity to start an Episcopal church. If you've ever gone up on C470, I guess it's E470, to about 35th Avenue, there's a new development up there called Aurora Highlands. It's got about 5,000 people now, and when it's fully developed, it'll be 50,000. There is no Episcopal church in that whole area, and it would be a great opportunity to start an Episcopal church up in that area also. Number 4 is to continue empowering and forming each baptized person to live their baptized calling. I consider that to be like motherhood and apple pie. I was going to argue with that, yeah, right. Yeah. So that's nice. The 5th one is what kind of surprised everybody, but when she announced that as the 5th one, she got the biggest applause from the audience. I'm not sure why. There's a lot of Christian schools around, Mullen and Valor and Denver Christian and Lutheran down in Parker and Regis. I guess there's always people that feel like, man, we'd like to have our own Episcopal high school. Wouldn't that be cool? I'm not sure how she'll do it. A lot of people have said, hey, maybe, we can buy out one of the schools and start it that way. So we'll see. But I thought that was interesting, just to kind of know what the, at least the 5 things that she put out there for us. The next thing is the budget. I'm not about to go through this. I will just say 3 or 4 highlights. Number 1, you can see there, if you look at the income, the total diocesan income is about 3.5 million. Most of that comes from pledges from our churches. I don't have it today, but you're going to get it eventually when we do regions. I'll actually give you the language that says that it is a mandated 10% pledge from each church and a suggested 5% to the region. The other big number there is the investment income, which are the trust distribution, which is about $1 million. If you're not aware of that, at one time, the Episcopal Church was, and the Presbyterian Church, each owned St. Luke's 50-50. And we didn't take any money when that was sold, and there's a complicated formula that was put in place that gives us revenue each year from that sale, and it's estimated to be $1 million for the budget for 26. So, yeah.
Just because it's interesting, this Tuesday we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of setting up that trust.
And I heard you're one of the people?
Yeah, I'll be going.
Okay. And the trust has never had a close relationship with us, I think the reason that is really important is because we try to find out how much that number is every year. And when I was on the standing committee, it was heck to try to find out what that number was ahead of time. It just kind of showed up. That number has varied anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million. So it's pretty important. There's a long story behind that, but I'll just stop there. You can go through all the expenses and you can see, actually, it says on the very last page, 3.1, you gotta add that 630 that isn't above it. And if you add that in, you'll get 3.74, and that's the reason there's a deficit of about 176. I sat in on the budget hearing yesterday, and if you listen to that and you hear the numbers from 24 and 25, all of this makes all these numbers look very reasonable. And like I said at the beginning, they currently have about $1 million in surplus, and consequently, they're not worried about a small amount like this. And so that's the budget. Now, the other part of that is, if you want, like I said, on the back table, there's 10 copies of the narrative budget. And a lot of people are more comfortable with a narrative budget than they are just looking at numbers. I'm very comfortable looking at numbers because I've done that a lot in my career. And so that's back there. The other thing that's on the back table is, as many of you know, they just named what is Archbishop of Canterbury. I put 10 copies of that back there also for you to pick up. I won't spoil the surprise, because several of you already know the surprise. So.
Even baked into the post.
So, okay. So after that comes the budget, and I got a lot of sheets here for the budget. The standing committee is the next thing that's listed in here. The standing committee is like the board of directors, really. They don't have a lot of power to do things, but they're an advisory group to the bishop. They have some really canon responsibilities that they have to do, like approving bishops and other dioceses. Those come before us. We actually get the final approval at the standing committee for candidates for ordination. But there's a whole process those candidates go through before they ever get to the standing committee, and so they're pretty well vetted in that work. But and it's kind of cool the way we do it. There's 2 representatives from each of the 5 regions. One is a lay person and one is a clergy person. So you have 10 people in addition to the bishop and the treasurer on the standing committee. Larry is there quite often if we have matters that he is involved with, and he'll be there for those particular issues. When I was on the standing committee, we met once about every 3 months, but we met in person, and people would come in from. Now you got to remember, 2 of these regions are the northwest and the southwest of the state, basically on the other side of the Continental Divide. And so you'll see when I talk to you about the regions, you'll see that financially the 2 biggest regions are Front Range and High Plains, which are right here. But this really makes it much more equal for the western regions to have some significant input on the standing committee, because each one has 2 representatives. There is one missing here. A couple things. Number one is Nadine just ran for another 3-year term, and she was elected to the standing committee. We do have a brand new representative named Kate Dykstra, who is coming. She's not listed here. She wasn't listed on the internet, but she not only is coming on as a new representative some important decision. For example, when we elected a new bishop, when we elected Bishop Kim, basically the standing committee is the one that had the responsibility for coordinating that and working with it. And so it's a fairly important responsibility. The next sheet in there is my report that was actually in. You got a question?
Yeah, Jim, I think on page 2 of your deal, your handout,
Yeah.
in the standing committee,
Yeah.
I thought there's 5 late,
Five lay.
and you have 3, or,
Yeah, keep
Keep
going,
going.
keep going. There's other pages.
Yeah, there's more pages.
oh, got it, sorry.
Yeah, they're all listed there.
Okay.
And in fact, our representative right now in clergy is Chris Ditzenberger. Chris is the rector over at St. Gabriel's. He is also, he was a missioner on the High Plains region during the time I was there, so he's very knowledgeable on the workings of the region and the diocese, and so good representative there. So you've got that. Now, going back to my report, I do want to say, this is the report that I put out for, and I did this just because I've done work on the diocesan level. It was probably easiest for me to do this. And I've, a lot of people come into the church and they hear that we're giving 10% to the diocese, and they go, why are we giving 10%? What does that do? What does that buy us? And so what I tried to do here is spend a little time and explain the overall concept of what goes on at the diocese. And a lot of that is on the front page. Even more of that is on the back of that page. If you go down to number 10, that's the one I really want to talk about, diocesan institutions. There's some interesting diocesan institutions. Number 2, which I mentioned already. When I did this report, they were only at 6.6 in the endowment. They just issued the report for this general convention, this diocesan convention next weekend in Pueblo. And actually at 6.6 has gone to 9.6, so I'm not sure how we got there that fast. I know the stock market has advanced, but I don't think it's advanced that much in the last 2 years. And they also managed 36 million for investments. Some of our money that we have set aside for future use or actually like a surplus, some of that money is also being managed by the diocese. And it's in this Colorado Episcopal Foundation. It's actually a 2-person shop now. Scott Asper is the head of it, and he has an assistant. The other one that's interesting here is number 7, which is St. Francis Center. Quite often I've been asked, well, what are you doing about the homeless and the problems we have in the diocese, and primarily probably in the Denver area, although it's all over. What are we doing from the Episcopal Church standpoint to help the homeless? Well, as many of you know, or maybe you don't know, the St. Francis Center has built 4 different apartments, and they're housing about 160 individuals and families. And these are people that were homeless, that were on the streets of Denver, and we've been able to put them in facilities, and those facilities are very well run. Each one of the facilities probably runs close to about $10 million. We had a very sharp individual at St. Francis Center who found out how to get money through the federal government, the state, and local city of Denver. And consequently, every one of those 4 apartment complexes, when they were finished and people began to occupy them, they were all paid for in full, which is pretty remarkable. And the more remarkable part of that is, we talked about earlier the diocesan budget, about $3.5 million. St. Francis's budget every year is, well, this next year it's gonna be $9 million. And so it's about 3 times the diocese that it reports to. And they do a heck of a job down there. I've been very supportive of it. They got a gala coming up here. Is it October? I think it's end of October. And if you want to see how to raise money in an evening, they will typically, between the sponsors and the dinner and the money they raise at that gala, they'll raise somewhere between $150,000 to $180,000 in one night. Yeah. So that's pretty impressive when we see what some of the other organizations are trying to do. So I just highlight that. If anybody ever asks you, what are you doing for the homeless, if you're church people, I think you can point to the St. Francis Center and be very proud of what they're doing.
St. Clair's too.
And St. Clair's too. We actually, we probably have, back a long time before Gary was here, a long time. The first organization, one of our deacons really pushed, Diane Moore, who some of you know. She really came into the church and really pushed St. Francis Center. And now we have Nadine Pope working as one of the coordinators down at St. Clair's. And a number of us have worked at St. Clair's, and it's really an interesting mission of providing a meal on Tuesday nights for the homeless or people that just need a meal. So we do, we actually are one of the I think it's one of the 5 churches that actually takes a Tuesday and provides the help for that, doing that. So between St. Clair's and St. Francis Center, we're doing some great things. St. Bridget's, they're very proud of this also up in Frederick. They just opened a 50-unit apartment complex for senior citizens, and the bishop is really excited about that and has shared about that. So many of these diocesan institutions are doing some really good things with the diocese. Okay. The next thing I put in here, at the beginning for the diocesan convention, we always are wondering how many lay delegates do we have at the diocesan convention. And so this actually shows, and I think this year they did it in alphabetical order. Yeah, maybe not. Yeah. Anyways, yeah, maybe they did.
Yes.
It's in alphabetical order. So you find your favorite church and you can see how many delegates, but perhaps more important is that actually we submit, Good Shepherd submits a report once a year to the diocese, and in there we have to put in there what our average Sunday attendance is. And so this is the average Sunday attendance for every church in the diocese. And so if you have your favorite church and you're wondering what their average Sunday attendance is, there it is. And we see this, those of us that have gone to diocesan convention several years, we see this every year. It's always interesting to look at. Now, the next page is an interesting page. I just created this. If you go back to 2019, we had the same data as what you were just looking at that time. And what I put in here is the average Sunday attendance. And what I was curious about was what was the average Sunday attendance pre-COVID, and what has been the average attendance post-COVID. And it's a real interesting number. If you just look at the bottom line, the Diocese of Colorado, we've seen a 22% decline in our attendance, which is substantial. And you can look at some of those numbers, and you can see, and there's a purpose why I did the grouping I did. Number one, in Colorado Springs, you'll notice there St. Michael's and All Angels has gone from 219 to 349. Many of you, some of you probably know the story, but they got a new rector down there, Matt Holcomb, and he at one time was the president of Invite, Welcome, and Connect, so he was very much involved with that program. And he actually came up and made a presentation to the High Plains region and what he's done down there. And so the question I keep getting asked occasionally is, well, gee, after COVID, we've lost some people. Can we really grow the church? Well, I would say that St. Michael's and Archangels found a way to grow the church. and that's pretty impressive. And they've done some unique things down there, and it's really worked well for them. You can see I grouped the Centennial churches in close. I included Castle Rock in that. You can see the numbers there. Most of them have gone down. Christchurch, Castle Rock has gone up slightly. The current missioner is at Christchurch, Castle Rock, named Brian Winter. And Brian is done an excellent job there. He also made an exceptional hire for somebody to do their Christian education program, who also does the YES program, which is the youth program for the diocese. And they've really brought in a lot of kids down there. And they've got a great ministry with young kids and for teenagers. And I think that's part of the reason that church has, basically gone up a little bit, but at least stayed level. I did look at the two largest churches in our region, both the Cathedral and Christchurch, Denver. They're pretty much in line with what most of the other churches are. I just thought they were interesting numbers because people always ask me, can we grow this church and how are we going to grow it? And I think there are ways out there. And I think we've seen that there are some churches in the diocese that are indeed growing. So there is hope, right? So, any questions on that? That was my sheet I just put together. And if anybody looks at this on Zoom, I would just say, when you see me in church or something, let me know, and I'll be happy to furnish that sheet to you, because that's one you probably can't get hold of. The last sheet in here is one that I did, which was very interesting for me personally. And what caused me to do this was interesting. As many of you know, I was head of the calling committee when we called Craig McCall, which was our third rector. And after Craig had been here about a year or two, we were talking one day, and I told him that, that there was a point in time when we actually had over 400 people in the church on a Sunday. And he looked at me, he said, "There's no way." So he caused me to publish this data, which the data is there and it's very interesting. But actually you can see there's 2 years, 2000 and 2001, when we actually had over 400 parishioners here on a Sunday. We had a first service, a second service, which was the family service, and a third service, which was highlighted by our musicians. And the second and third service were very well attended. John Johansson was here and Bonnie Spencer were here. They worked very well together as two individuals. And at one point in time there, we were the 4th fastest growing church in the United States.
The other thing was that Highlands Ranch was growing up.
And Highlands Ranch was being built out, and that really helped a lot too. And I don't know, that might have been before even St. Tim's moved down here. No, I think it was about the same time. Yeah. So, but there's other interests. You can see how many numbers of pledges we had. You can see there for a long time we were paying on debt in the church, and we finally have gotten to a position which we don't have to pay debt, which also assisted us to, you can see there for the last 5 years, we've actually given 10% to the diocese, which is our mandated pledge to the diocese. So the numbers are interesting just to look at. I like to look at numbers. I'm an engineer, so they mean something to me. A lot of people go, well, I don't like numbers that much. And so that walks you through the package that you have in your hand. Now, listen, questions or things that you'd like to talk about, or we'll get out of here early. Gary, I don't know, you might want to say something.
I want to hear the questions.
I want to hear the questions too. I'd be happy to answer questions, but what I was trying to do here is put together a look at the diocese and look at how we served under Bishop Rob, got to know him really well. If you guys know, one of the characteristics of Rob, I always laugh about even today. We'd have discussions, and there was a look that Bishop Rob had, and when he gave the standing committee that look, that meant discussion is over. We're ready to move on to the next thing. And I don't even know if Rob knew he had that look, but he did.
He was big enough to enforce it too.
And it was exciting to go through the election of a new bishop. And for 6 years being on the standing committee, I always had a seat at diocesan convention, so I didn't even need to be elected from Good Shepherd. Yes.
Do you have some historicals and numbers for Cathedral Ridge? And maybe we can do that when the.
Yeah, John will be here.
Yeah, and if you come to that one, I will show you everything you ever wanted to know about Cathedral Ridge. In fact, I will show you more than John even wants you to know. I sat through, I think in my time, we went through 1, 2, 3, 4. We've gone through 4 leaders for Cathedral Ridge. And it's been a real interesting. I won't say much about that. It's a real interesting story, though, to share. And and how the Western Slope people feel about that whole thing and so forth. So come to that one, Sandra, and you'll get all your questions answered. Yeah.
But you've done such a good job with all the other stuff, so that's.
Yeah. And well, it's been a fun 14 years for me to get to know so many people throughout the diocese and have the opportunity to be in a position to, if you're the secretary, 2 things about that. Number one, you got to listen very carefully because you're going to have to print out the minutes from the meeting and send it out to everybody. Secondly, the difficulty is being the secretary. It's hard to talk because you're trying to take the minutes down, and when you try to put into your position, you forget to write down what you said as part of the minutes. So it was interesting, though, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Mike.
Jim had a great report on the money that we give to all of the regions, the money spent. You might want to consider an annual addition just to what money was spent for that year. So such an eye-opening when you gave that to me, say about 2 years ago. Actually, the money we were sending was being used very wisely and timely.
Yeah. Let me explain to you, the group, why I did that and why that even came up. Sitting in on the standing committee, I was very much aware that the bishop was very interested in the numbers for every church. And for those churches that weren't giving the 10%, he would have a list. He'd make a list after the finance committee meeting, and he would call each church and ask them, what's your plan to get up to 10%? And he did that, and he really worked hard to increase that giving to the diocese from the various churches. If you know much about that, it says it's a mandatory 10% to the diocese. Rob was always very interesting because he said, I asked for 10% from the churches, so I'm going to give 10% to the national church, which didn't set well with the national church because at that time they were at 19%, and then they changed that and went down to 15%. And Rob had been a bishop long enough that he just, if anybody asked him about it, he said, I asked for 10% from my people, I'm going to give you 10%. When Bishop Kim came in, she made the decision to gradually increase it up to 15%. You can make the argument that that's 10% from the diocese, from the churches for the 10% from the churches and 5% to the regions. But in reality, the regions, Bishop Rob really was concerned about the money coming into the diocese. He wasn't as concerned about how much was going into the regions. I think Kim is somewhere in between that, but I don't think Kim would still push the 10% to the diocese and hope that that increases to the regions. But giving what the giving was for the regions to do their work amounted to about $350,000 a year from the 5 regions. And then the regions take that and split it up. And when I do the region presentation, you'll see exactly how it's split up. But for example, High Plains region, we're now at about 150,000. So we look at what's going on in our region. What are the nonprofits or the churches that either need help or are doing outstanding work in our region? And then they all come to us and they make a presentation, and then the board or the executive committee makes a decision on how that money is given out. Well, it's really done very well, but there's no place for the 6 years that I was on the standing committee, we ever talk about that. Nobody actually ever knows for sure how much money they're taking in and how it's going out. So in 2019, as I was finishing my term on the High Plains region, on the standing committee, I decided I was going to put together a report showing exactly how much we got and where it was going. And that's what Mike is talking about. I did a second report that Mike was involved in handing out in 23. Mike's just suggested that, well, why don't you do that every year? Mike, you don't have any idea how hard or how much work that takes to do that report. I have to work with the controller, who is a good friend of mine, Pam, and I see a lot of data that probably a lot of people don't even see, and that is I see the actual giving, I see the P&P, which is the plate and the pledge for every church in the diocese. And then I see how much they're giving to the diocesan pledge, and I saw how much they're giving to the region. And that's where I got those numbers from. And I probably could do it, but it's hard to put all those numbers together. That's why I did coming off, I knew I was coming off coming off the High Plains region, and so I did another report in 23. I'm just sorry that the diocese doesn't give that report every year, because I think it's the work that's being done by the regions is probably more exciting than some of the work that's being done by the diocese. Don't take that away. But I mean, all the money that they take in is going to various organizations, and we are blessed. Shelley Hitt is on the executive committee, and so is Nadine. You will never see another person serve 14 years on that. I did that because I did 2 years, then I did 6 on the standing committee, and then they didn't have a treasurer, and they asked me if I'd be their treasurer, so I did that for 6 years. And so that's how I ended up with the 14 years. And just the way the terms are staggered, it's pretty hard to get 14 years in there. I love the work, and I kind of was the person that knew the history of what had happened, and so a lot of times I was valuable, I think, for sharing with them, okay, came up before, here's how we handled it before. We can certainly handle it a new way, but at least they had that reference, so.
He's just the guy who can say no.
Oh, he said no this year. Shelley?
I just put in a plug for our region. We meet at least 3 hours every other month, and sometimes a little more during grant season, which is coming up here momentarily. And I'm not sure I've ever been a part of a group that you actually look forward to a 3-hour meeting. And a group of incredibly conscientious, thoughtful, committed people who are really trying to do the right thing and spend the money in the best way possible to serve the greatest number of people in a very Christian manner. So I commend that group for the work they do.
And when we do the grants, we hear some of the stories that would just blow you away. I mean, there's an organization, I think the one that blew us away the last couple of years was this organization that brother started in the inner city of Denver, and it was a hospice, and it was to give dignity to the homeless people who were dying. And usually in the past, they just died on the street. And he actually has money for a place that has 3 beds, and it gives dignity to the homeless people when they're in that situation. I mean, we had no idea this existed, and I mean, I think everybody, after they heard that presentation, was just blown away.
He's at St. Gregory's, yeah.
You see? Yeah. It was an amazing ministry. But
Well, and that should be written up, that should be publicized.
That should be.
Getting back to the point you were making,
yeah,
that those projects should
Right.
be well known.
yeah,
When you see 15%, it's like, yeah, all the priests and bishops have Cadillacs. I mean, it's kind of the first thing that enters your mind. When you see the report, you go, oh, you did $35,000 for a church that needed a new roof, otherwise they couldn't have gotten one. Or we did a training program for teenagers that was $7,500. When you see that list, you go, oh, okay, I can give. And I'm willing to accept that 15% because we're spending the money in a Christian manner. But we weren't showing that until you did the report. I encourage you to consider developing the 2 or 3 people that do it, and not just you, so that we can get feedback.
yeah.
To dispel
Mike
that
wants
attitude.
to be one of them.
I can, I have a degree in finance.
Actually, that report isn't that hard to
You have
put
a
together.
degree in
It just
finance?
takes some time.
So I
And you
know-
gotta be in a position that you know the right people to get the data from, so.
It might be worthwhile for the diocese to look at the individual projects, and perhaps we could focus on individual projects, maybe once, every couple of 3 weeks. They have some sort of write-up with specific books on one individual, and what we're doing in this little town, what we're doing in the city of Denver, what we're doing here or there.
Demands people.
It does depend people, but it would be, I think, a way of helping the membership, kind of the individuals in the congregation understand and perhaps increase.
We're currently giving 2% to them, and our plan was to increase that every year by 1% till we got to 5. We're struggling with a little bit. You'll hear more about this, on the budget.
Oh, that's an interesting sliver.
That's an interesting sliver. So, I would have really pushed to increase that by 1% a year, because I think the 5% that goes to the region does amazing work, and I get more excited about that than some of the things that are going on at the diocesan level. So,
It's more individual, it's more individual, more focused in our, each area can see in their own area what's happening.
Any other questions? We've been going for 50 minutes here. It's great, and I'm so grateful for Jim for proposing all this. Larry, did you want to?
I wanted to thank Jim again. He's been so incredibly valuable to Good Shepherd and to the diocese. And I know, and to the region, but really what you have done is just above and beyond, and we are eternally grateful to you.
Well, he knows he wasn't allowed to stay home.
I love it. Thanks,
Beth, we can talk more about that later.
I was going to say
The
that
Methodist.
the story, and I didn't include it at the beginning, but I meant to. But is when I did retire, finally in 2011, Beth, you were already sewing for Salvation Army, weren't you?
Yep.
Okay, so she served. I'm sure many of you know this. Beth sews for the Salvation Army 9 months of the year, and then they have a sale in November. So she's a very busy person. And the biggest fear she had is every morning she was afraid her retired husband was going to say, "Okay, honey, what are we going to do today?" And we have been very fortunate. The truth is, some people like to travel, some people like to play golf, tennis, and so forth when they retire. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, to be real honest with you. I knew I wanted to do something. And so I play church. And So it kept me very busy, and I love the work. I really love the work. And like I said, I met a lot of great people along the way, so I know a lot of people throughout the diocese. And, you know, Larry's being very kind, but, you know, turn it around on Larry. How many years have you been the chancellor?
35.
35 years he's been the chancellor for the diocese. And that's a tough position, because whereas I can come here and share all this stuff with you, most of the stuff that Larry does is confidential. And so, you know, in fact, I'm sorry you didn't say a little bit more yesterday at the budget hearing, because I knew that gentleman was thinking, why are we spending so much on a chancellor for this diocese? And he had no idea what actually goes on. And Larry is limited in what he can say. But I'll tell you, it's a tough position because he gets into unique opportunities.
Stressful, stressful, stressful.
All right, well, thank you all. Thank you, Jim. I'm going to call us with close here to free everybody who needs to go and do other things, whether it's Oakville or AV Box or whatever it is that they need to do. But thank you. We'll be back next week, and Larry will be back. God knows that he can make it here by 9 o'clock. And he'll be here with Bishop F. Daly to talk about how the municipal church makes public policy decisions. What's our role in all of that? You know, there's been some conversation, certainly in the last little bit, about whether or not the church should be involved in all those kinds of ways, and, you know, how does the church make that decision? Worthy topic of conversation.
And to give you a flavor for after that, Cathedral Ridge will be the third week. The fourth week, we will talk, the delegates to convention will share with you what they learned at convention, what surprised them, and so forth. So that's an exciting opportunity. And the last week, we'll talk about the regions in much more detail. And if you'll come to Cathedral Ridge, I'll answer your question. If you come to the regions, I'll answer all your questions.
Nobody knows that. It's the best kept secret going.
We're in a big mess. No, I asked up to the first one.
Hello, sir.
I told Jim, he's already showing us up with all these handouts, because Chris and I are pretty loosely prepared, it's fair to say.
That's fine.
Yeah.
There's enough to say.
No.
But either of you are engineers.
Yeah. Show us.
Yeah, it was, the mechanic, you know, there's a big O tires, 0.2 miles from where it was parked overnight. And I always take my car to Big O anyway, but they said, well, you don't know, the alternator's kind of doing some fluctuation, but it's working and it's fine. And they said, and the battery's doing some fluctuation, but it's working. And I said, Jim's battery. Said the alternator, if the alternator's bad, you know, we'll figure that out. But the car's got 60,000 miles, battery's coming up in 4 years. I'm gonna have to do that anyway.
Yeah, with winter coming up anyway.
Yeah, so anyway, it was just a couple hours and they go.
Yeah.
Working on this one.
Yeah, okay.